Hi everybody, my name is Dennis, and welcome back to another album review. Today we are reviewing the latest record from Cacola, entitled A Gift to Us All. Now Cacola is one of, not necessarily a newer artist, but an artist who's just now kind of bubbling up out of within the underground as far as this drum and bass style of music tends to go. There are a few artists who have been popularizing it recently, still within kind of the underground scene. It's not really, a very radio friendly or popular vibe to it. The most notable names of the bunch being Sewer Slut. And I didn't really know where this was gonna go. I hadn't listened to any of Cacola's albums prior, but this was definitely a gift. It was a very enjoyable, very fun, and very catchy record most of the way through. There's plenty of great ideas, great concepts, clever sampling on here, but the album is very messy. And the messiness definitely detracts from here, but it's also, ironically, the album's greatest strength at points. Where, it's like you don't really know where it's going to go, and it seems like Cacola, when making this, didn't know where it was going to go either. So, it just ends up sometimes being genius and sometimes being just really, really disconnected. And I will say it works much more often than it doesn't. The opening two tracks, for example, are both stellar. The Perfect Circle is a great opener, has these really fast, heavy-hitting drum lines. It's one of the glitchier and more electronic cuts on here. It's a bit grimier, it's a bit more aggressive, it's a bit punchier. And we have these layers upon layers upon layers of synths that just really add to the overall atmosphere of this entire track, making it a very, very great almost 8 minutes. And it's diverse enough to where you really can still feel engaged with the entire track, and it never really gets stale. There is variation in some of the melodies and some of the pacing between various aspects of it. It stays interesting the whole way through. Bird is another great track on here. It features this really gorgeous whistling kind of sound at the beginning that has a really nice catchiness to it, and it transitions into this really fun line where we have, again, these hard-hitting drums, these layers of synths, but in a much more uplifting and catchy, almost video game aesthetic way. Unlike the previous track, The Perfect Circle, which was much more of an aggressive, grimy sound. And Birds works perfectly also. There's really not a dull moment across this entire song. It's consistently catchy, it's very on point, and it is just such a fun track to listen to. However, the next couple of tracks do bring out some of those issues I brought earlier of it just being messy. Unused Assets is the prime example of this, where it really does sound like just a bunch of unused assets smushed together. We have bits of electronic in here, some synth pop. It kind of poorly transitions into this like really aggressive heavy metal, and then it goes back into the synth pop, and it's just such an awkward mix of sounds and styles. The transitions are neither smooth nor clever. There's really nothing about this track that really impresses me. Individual moments on here are good. Like those heavy metal guitars sound great on their own, but in the context of this track, they're just really awkward and out of place. There's nothing even close to resembling this on any other point on the record, and it doesn't last for very long at all. It's just really, really awkward. It's not a bad song per se, it's just way too long, way too messy, and doesn't have any sort of consistency to it. The following track, A Room with No Doors, is another so-so moment on here. If this was the build-up to a much longer track, this could be phenomenal. It's eerie, it's distorted, it's kind of sharp and really scratches on your ears, but in a really creepy and interesting way, and then the track ends. It would have been a beautiful opener to a much more fully fleshed out idea, but again, that messiness and inconsistency of the record just kind of keeps it from doing that. It doesn't really transition well from the previous track, it doesn't transition well into the next track, And what would be just a great opener to a much longer piece ends up just kind of fizzling out for what it is. However, the next track on here is one that I enjoyed quite a bit. It's one of the, I think, the longest song on here, almost reaching 10 minutes. It's called Flowers and Snakes, and it has a feature of Raw in the Void on the organ, which ends up sounding amazing. I think the organs on this track are nothing if not gorgeous. There's again many synth lines, and there's many distorted electronic sharp bass lines on here. You know, really in your face drumming. But there's also these really pretty keyboards on here, and we have a sample on here of Neo's Closer towards the end of the track, which works surprisingly well. The vocals are distorted and pitched very high up. But it works with the tone of the track and the whole aesthetic of this song. There's a lot of great aesthetics on here. I love the points where it kind of goes for a more ambient style, not just on here, but on some previous tracks as well. It switches up enough to where it's interesting, but not so disconnected that it feels disorienting. I do think Flowers and Snakes is a messier song overall, and if you really hated Unused Assets, I can see why you wouldn't like this one either, because it does have some similar signs of just almost personality or identity disorder, but not to the extent that Unused Assets is, where you skip a minute ahead and it sounds like a completely different song. This one at least kind of has a consistent theme. It runs back to itself, and it has enough interesting sounds and fun samples on here to really make it worth it. And then the following track is one of, if not my favorite song on the entire thing, called Birthday Girl. This one has such a sweet, warm piano melody to it that runs through the entire track. It's really gorgeous. It blends in really well when the kind of, again, that heavy hitting drum and bass style we got going on. Once that really hits in, the pianos still work beautifully with it. And this is one of those tracks where the kind of messiness of it works beautifully in its favor. Because we have a seemingly random sample of Welcome to the Black Parade by My Chemical Romance. Who would think of that? Who would think to put that on such a wild album like this? You know, it doesn't seem calculated all that much, but it works perfectly. It doesn't seem, precise or meticulously put together, but it was like, hey, this would be fun to do on this. Let's do this. And it worked. And it worked beautifully. I think that Gerard Way's vocals sample on here just really complements the sound of the track in such a gorgeous way, and it makes it nostalgic in a lot of ways. Maybe that's my own personal bias, but it adds this really warm, nostalgic feel to the tail end of the track when he kicks in, and it just ends up being such a beautiful moment. That's another thing about this record. The sampling on here is just on point at almost every step of the game. There are countless samples on here. My Chemical Romance, Christina Aguilera, Neo, Muse, Radiohead, just to name a few. Huge artists that are sampled across this record, and almost every one is pulled off really well. Even if the overall track that they're featured on isn't necessarily great, the sample is spot on, and I really got to give props to Cacola on that, because the sampling and the skill at which they're able to sample stuff is just so good. Another one of the best tracks on here is How to Take Complete Control of Everything and Everyone. Has one of the catchiest instrumentals on this entire... I don't know why I call it instrumental. The whole album is essentially instrumentals, but one of the catchiest beats of this whole record. It's got, again, these beautiful synthesizers on here. They're layered so perfectly. The drumming is just so catchy. It's so fun. The electronic beats are just hard-hitting every step of the way. And this is the one that features that Christina Aguilera sample that works perfectly. And there are other vocal samples towards the start of the track and the end of the track that just build upon this atmosphere so wonderfully. It's a very atmospheric track. There's a lot of beautiful moments to it. And definitely one of the prettier songs on here, I think. However, the final two tracks on here are weak moments, I believe, again. Tapers is definitely a weak track. It goes on for way too long. I do not like the vocal feature on here from, I believe it's pronounced Mokshadrip. Mokshadrip just does not sound good. He sounds like a, I don't know, like a bootleg Owl City, and I don't know why you would want to sound like Owl City, because I know their vocalist is not good. That he's just not good. It gives me those kinds of vibes. I don't care for the tune all that much, and it's not as messy as some other tracks on here, but it just didn't really do anything for me. There were parts of the beat that I thought were nice. They had some catchy moments to it, but it just didn't do that much for me overall. And the closer track on here, Age of Disintegration, is kind of a similar story to A Room with No Doors, where this would be a great build up to something grander, but the track is relatively short. It doesn't really build into anything, and it kind of fizzles out, which is really disappointing for a closing track, I think. Especially when you develop this whole record that's almost an hour in length, and then you close it off this poorly. It's really disheartening, I think. It's again, it's one of those. It's not as messy. It's just it wasn't as well thought out as I think it could have been. And that's really the greatest sin of this whole record, is just things weren't necessarily thought all the way through, I don't believe. You know, whether it be tracks that would be great intros that have great samples on them that just kind of fizzle out, or the mess of ideas that make up certain tracks on here, it's definitely a disorienting listen at points. But when this album hits, it hits hard. And it is so, so good. The tracks on here that I enjoy, I love almost all of them. If there were more tracks like that, maybe, they cleaned up some of the weaker tracks on here, maybe scrapped some ideas that weren't as good, this could have been a really, really great album. Overall, I'm feeling a strong 6 on this one, bordering on a light 7. It's worth a listen. There are tracks on here that I think are great. It's definitely fun to listen to. It's messy. It's a bit all over the place, but I can see a lot of potential from Cacola. So with that being said, if you listen to this album, tell me what you thought of it down in the comments below. Tell me how wrong my opinion is, as always, and I'll see you in the next review.